Prince William took decisive action, completely cutting off all royal funding intended for Camilla.
William did not go after Camilla directly. Who did he target instead? He went after someone she loves. And when Princess Anne's name surfaced as the person who told him exactly where to aim, the palace fell completely silent. Let's unravel this story. The action nobody saw coming. There is a particular kind of move within the British royal family that carries more weight than its immediate practical consequences suggest. It is the kind of move that is understood by everyone who witnesses it, not simply as a decision about a specific situation, but as a signal about the disposition of the person making it. A signal about how far they are prepared to go, what they are willing to risk, and how clearly they have thought through the implications of what they are doing. The action Prince William took against Camilla's grandson in the early months of 2025 was precisely that kind of move. And according to those with knowledge of what happened and why, its impact inside the royal household was immediate, significant, and exactly as William intended it to be. The details of the specific action William took are described by sources with the careful circumspection that characterizes discussions of the royal family's most sensitive internal decisions. What insiders confirm is that William moved to have Camilla's grandson's access to certain royal-adjacent spaces and opportunities formally reviewed and in key respects curtailed. The young man in question had been quietly building a presence in circles that sit close to the institutional life of the monarchy without being formally part of it. Philanthropic networks, cultural organizations, and social environments that carry the implicit endorsement of royal adjacency, without requiring the kind of official authorization that would attract immediate scrutiny. It was in those spaces that William's action landed. And it landed, sources say, with a precision that reflected detailed prior knowledge of exactly where the young man's presence had been established and what it represented. That precision is the detail that struck those inside the royal household most forcefully when news of what William had done began to circulate through the inner circle. Precision of that kind does not emerge from casual observation, or from the kind of general awareness of palace dynamics that any senior royal might be expected to maintain. It reflects specific detailed information about the particular spaces the young man had been occupying, the specific relationships he had been cultivating, and the exact points at which his presence intersected with interests and networks that William had reason to be concerned about. Someone had given William that information, and the question of who had done so was one that Camilla's circle began working to answer almost immediately. The answer, when it emerged, was the one that sent the most significant shockwave through the royal household. Because the person who had provided William with the detailed knowledge that made his action possible was not a disgruntled courtier or a palace insider with a personal grievance against Camilla's family. It was Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, the king's only sister, a woman who had spent decades maintaining a public posture of careful neutrality in the internal disputes of the royal family, and whose decision to share what she knew with William represented a departure from that posture so significant that those who learned of it struggled initially to accept that it had actually occurred. For those who understand the internal dynamics of the royal family, the involvement of Princess Anne transformed what might otherwise have been interpreted as a bilateral dispute between William and Camilla into something considerably more consequential. Anne is not a peripheral figure in the institutional life of the monarchy. She is one of its most respected and most experienced members, a royal who has earned the regard of those around her through decades of relentless hard work, fierce personal integrity, and a willingness to speak plainly in private that those who have benefited from her candor regard as one of her most valuable qualities. When Anne chooses to act, it is never carelessly, and when she chooses to share information with someone, it is because she has concluded, after the kind of careful deliberation that characterizes everything she does, that sharing it serves a purpose she believes in. William's reaction when Anne came to him, according to sources who have been briefed on the exchange, was one of careful attention rather than immediate action. He is described by those who know him well as a man who does not move on significant decisions without first satisfying himself that his understanding of the situation is complete and that the action he is contemplating will achieve what he intends without producing consequences he has not accounted for. The information Anne provided gave him a level of specificity about Camilla's grandson's activities and positioning that he had not previously possessed. He took time with it, He considered it. He consulted in the careful and limited way that reflects his instinct for keeping his most sensitive deliberations within the tightest possible circle, with the advisors he trusts most completely. And then he acted. The manner in which he acted reflected everything that those who have watched his evolution as an institutional figure have come to expect from him. It was clean. It was final. It left no obvious avenue for reversal or appeal. And it was targeted with a specificity that communicated to everyone capable of reading the signal that the person behind it knew exactly what he was doing and had known for some time. When the consequences of William's action became apparent to Camilla's household, the first question her circle asked was not what William had done. It was how he had known enough to do it so precisely. And when the answer pointed toward Princess Anne, the implications of that answer rippled outward through the royal family in ways that are still being felt. Understanding those implications requires understanding who Camilla's grandson is and what his presence in royal adjacent spaces actually represented. Who is Camilla's grandson and why he matters? To understand why William's action against Camilla's grandson carried the weight that it did, it is necessary to first understand the family structure from which that young man comes, and the particular significance his position holds within the broader network of relationships that surround the queen consort. Because Camilla is not simply a stepmother and a wife within the royal world, she is the center of a family constellation that extends outward from her immediate household into the wider social and cultural landscape of British aristocratic life. And the members of that constellation, whether they carry official titles or not, benefit from a proximity to the crown that shapes their opportunities, their access, and their standing in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but that are understood with considerable clarity by those who inhabit the world in which they move. Camilla has 5 grandchildren, the children of her son, Tom Parker Bowles, and her daughter, Laura Lopes. They occupy a position within the extended royal family that is genuinely unusual. They are close enough to the monarchy to move in circles that carry its reflected prestige and to benefit from the relationships and opportunities that proximity to the crown creates. But they are distant enough from the formal structures of the institution to operate without the kind of official scrutiny and protocol constraints that govern the lives of those with working royal status. That combination of proximity and freedom is, in the assessment of those who have thought carefully about it, a powerful one. It creates space for the kind of quiet influence building that official royal figures cannot easily engage in, precisely because their every move is subject to public attention and institutional oversight. The specific grandson at the center of William's action is described by sources as a young man who has, over the past several years, been making deliberate and increasingly visible use of exactly that space. His name is not one that appears regularly in royal coverage. He does not attend official engagements or feature in the kind of formal royal photography that documents the public life of the institution. But within the particular world of London's philanthropic and cultural elite, a world that sits in close and comfortable proximity to the monarchy, without being formally part of it, his presence has been growing with a consistency that sources say did not go unnoticed by those paying attention within William's circle. The specific areas in which he had been building his presence are described by insiders as carefully chosen. Charitable organizations with royal connections provided one avenue. Cultural institutions whose boards and advisory structures include figures with close ties to the royal household provided another. Social networks built around the intersection of aristocratic tradition and contemporary British public life provided a third. In each of these spaces, his grandmother's position gave him an initial point of entry that his own developing professional credentials and social skills then allowed him to consolidate. He was not, by the accounts of those who encountered him in these environments, simply trading on the Camilla connection in an obvious or unsophisticated way. He was using it as a door opener, and then doing the work of making himself genuinely present and useful once inside. That combination of inherited access and developing personal capability is precisely what made him a meaningful figure rather than simply a peripheral one. A young man who relied entirely on his grandmother's position would have been easy to dismiss and easy to manage. A young man who is actively converting that positional advantage into genuine relationships and genuine influence within networks that mattered to the future of the monarchy was something considerably more significant. And sources say it was the recognition of that significance, conveyed to William through the detailed briefing Anne provided, and that transformed his assessment of the situation from a background concern into something requiring direct action. What specifically concerned William about the young man's activities in these circles is described by sources with the careful vagueness that reflects both the sensitivity of the information and the legal considerations that surround any discussion of a private individual who has not chosen a public role. What insiders are consistent in conveying is that the concern was not primarily about the young man himself or about his personal motivations. The concern was structural. It was about the way his presence in certain networks created channels through which information and influence could flow between those networks and Camilla's household in ways that were not transparent and not subject to the kind of oversight that the integrity of those networks required. Several of the organizations in which the young man had established a presence had relationships with William's own philanthropic and institutional work that made the existence of those channels particularly sensitive. The Royal Foundation's partnerships, its donor relationships, and its strategic planning processes all created touch points with the broader philanthropic landscape that a well-positioned individual with connections to Camilla's circle could potentially exploit for informational advantage. Whether or not that exploitation was occurring deliberately or systematically is a question that sources are careful not to answer definitively. What they confirm is that the structural possibility of it was real, and that William's assessment, informed by Anne's briefing, was that the possibility was sufficiently serious to warrant direct action. The young man's response to the curtailment of his access in certain spaces is described by sources as one of genuine surprise. He had not, it appears, understood his own positioning within these networks as anything other than the natural development of personal and professional relationships that he had cultivated on his own merits. Whether that understanding was entirely accurate or whether it reflected a degree of compartmentalization about the advantages his family connection provided is something that those familiar with the situation assess differently. What is not in dispute is that the action William took registered with Camilla's household as a deliberate and targeted message. And understanding who delivered the intelligence that made that message possible requires a much closer look at the woman who has been watching Camilla's family with quiet attention for considerably longer than anyone realized. Anne's secret, the information that changed everything. There are people within the British royal family who accumulate knowledge the way other people accumulate possessions. Quietly, consistently, and with a patience that reflects a deep understanding of the fact that information inside an institution as closed and as image-conscious as the monarchy is one of the most valuable currencies available to those who possess it. Princess Anne is one of those people. She has spent more than 5 decades at the center of the royal family's institutional life, observing its internal dynamics with the kind of unflinching attention that her public reputation for plain-spoken practicality only partially captures. She watches, she listens. She files away what she learns with the careful precision of someone who understands that the moment at which information becomes useful is rarely the moment at which it is acquired, and she waits, sometimes for years, for the circumstances in which what she knows can be deployed to maximum effect. That moment, sources say, arrived in the closing months of 2024, and when it did, Anne did not hesitate. The information that Princess Anne brought to William was not, according to those familiar with its contents, a single dramatic revelation of the kind that produces immediate headlines. It was something more complex and in many ways more significant than that. It was a detailed, carefully assembled picture of a pattern of activity that had been developing over a period of years, and that, taken as a whole, told a story about the reach and the ambition of Camilla's family network that William had not previously been in a position to see with full clarity. Anne had been building that picture for a long time, and the decision to share it with William reflected a judgment that the pattern it revealed had reached a point where it could no longer be monitored and noted without being actively addressed. Sources who have been briefed on the substance of what Anne shared describe it as falling into several distinct categories of concern. The first involved the specific networks and organizations in which Camilla's grandson had been establishing his presence, the detail of which relationships he had cultivated within those networks, and the points at which those relationships created meaningful overlap with William's own institutional interests and the broader landscape of the future reign. Anne had been tracking that overlap with a specificity that suggested her attention to it had been sustained and deliberate rather than incidental. She knew which organizations were involved, which individuals within those organizations had been approached, and what the nature of the interactions had been. That level of detail was not the product of casual observation. It was the product of active and ongoing attention.
The second category of information Anne shared concerned the broader pattern of activity within Camilla's family network, of which the grandson's positioning was only the most recent and most visible expression.
Sources say Anne presented William with a picture that extended back several years and that documented, with the kind of chronological precision that reflects careful record-keeping, the gradual expansion of Camilla's family's presence in spaces adjacent to the institutional life of the monarchy. The grandson was not an isolated case. He was the latest iteration of a pattern that had manifested in different ways and through different family members over a sustained period of time. Seeing the individual instances placed within that broader pattern changed the way they registered. What might have appeared viewed in isolation as the natural social mobility of a family benefiting from a well-connected grandmother became, when viewed as part of a sustained and consistent pattern, something that looked considerably more deliberate. The third element of what Anne shared is described by sources as the most sensitive and the most significant. It involves specific instances in which the activities of Camilla's family members in royal adjacent spaces had intersected with matters of genuine institutional sensitivity. Insiders are reluctant to specify the exact nature of those intersections, citing both the sensitivity of the information and the need to protect the sources through whom Anne had acquired it. What they confirm is that the instances Anne documented were sufficient to establish, in William's assessment, that the structural concerns about information flow and influence that had already been on his radar were grounded in something more concrete than theoretical possibility. They reflected actual occurrences that had actual implications for the integrity of the institutional spaces in which they had taken place. What is perhaps most striking about Anne's decision to bring this information to William is the question of why she brought it when she did, rather than earlier. Those who know her well say the timing reflected a characteristic deliberateness about the conditions she required before acting. Anne does not move on significant matters until she is confident that the person she is moving toward is ready to act on what she gives them. She had been watching William's development as an institutional figure with the careful attention of someone assessing readiness, and the moves he had made over the preceding months, the foundation appointments, the Sandringham decisions, and the broader pattern of quiet but decisive action that had characterized his approach to institutional matters, had satisfied her that he had reached the point at which the information she held could be given to him with confidence that it would be used effectively. The relationship between Anne and William that made this transfer of information possible is one that has developed quietly over many years, and that reflects a depth of mutual respect that is not always visible in the public record of their interactions. Anne has, by the accounts of those close to both of them, always seen in William a quality that she values above almost all others in those who bear the responsibilities of royalty, a seriousness of purpose that distinguishes genuine commitment to the institution from the performance of it. She has watched that quality develop and strengthen in him over the years of his preparation for kingship, and when she concluded that the information she held about Camilla's family network needed to be in his hands, it was that quality, more than any other consideration, that made him the person she chose to give it to. For Camilla, the revelation that Anne had been accumulating this information and had chosen to share it with William was not simply as a tactical setback in a specific dispute. It was a fundamental reassessment of a relationship she had always believed she understood, and what that reassessment revealed about the depth of Anne's reservations about her position and her family's activities within the royal world has changed the landscape of the conflict in ways that are still being reckoned with. Anne and Camilla, a rivalry hiding in plain sight. There is a category of rivalry within the British royal family that never announces itself publicly, and that the people involved would strenuously deny if asked about it directly. It is the kind of rivalry that exists not in open confrontation or visible competition, but in the careful management of distance, in the pointed absence of warmth where warmth might be expected, and in the accumulation of private judgments about another person's character and conduct that are shared selectively with trusted figures only, and never in any form where they might be quoted back to their source. The rivalry between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla belongs to exactly that category. It has been hiding in plain sight for years, visible to those who know how to read the signals and invisible to those who take the public performances of royal unity at face value. And it has been building, with the patient intensity of something that has never been properly addressed since long before Camilla became queen consort. To understand the origins of Anne's reservations about Camilla, it is necessary to go back to the period that shaped Anne's understanding of what Camilla represented within the family. Anne was not simply an observer of the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. She was a participant in the institutional consequences of it, a senior royal who had to navigate the public fallout of one of the most damaging episodes in the modern monarchy's history, while continuing to perform her own duties with the discipline and the consistency that has always defined her approach to royal service. She watched what the exposure of Charles's relationship with Camilla did to the institution she had devoted her life to serving. She absorbed the public contempt that the revelations generated. And she formed in that period a set of judgments about Camilla's role in the damage the monarchy sustained that she has never fully revised. Those who know Anne well are careful to distinguish between her personal feelings toward Camilla and her institutional concerns about her. The two are related but not identical. On a personal level, Anne is described by sources as someone who has maintained a posture toward Camilla that is superficially correct without ever being genuinely warm. The idea that a position within the monarchy should be used primarily as a platform for advancing the interests of one's own family is, to Anne, not merely a tactical error. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the institution is and what it demands of those who represent it. Watching Camilla's behavior since the king's accession through that philosophical lens has generated in Anne a level of private concern that sources describe as significant and sustained. The embedding of Camilla's family members in royal adjacent spaces, the expansion of her inner circle's influence within the household, and what Anne perceives as the consistent use of proximity to the king to advance personal rather than institutional interests, have all registered with that as Princess Royal as precisely the kind of behavior that her own lifetime of service has taught her to regard as corrosive to the foundations on which the monarchy's public legitimacy rests. There is also, sources suggest, a dimension to the Anne and Camilla dynamic that is more personal and more directly competitive than the institutional framing might suggest. Both women occupy positions of significant seniority within the royal family. Both have strong personalities, clear views about how the institution should be run, and a history of navigating the internal politics of the monarchy with considerable skill. But their approaches to that navigation are, in almost every significant respect, opposed. Anne's style is direct, transparent, and consistently subordinated to institutional priority. Camilla's style is indirect, relationship-driven, and, in Anne's private assessment, insufficiently careful about the line between personal interest and institutional responsibility. Two women with strong views, opposed philosophies, and a history of unspoken but deeply felt disagreements about the conduct of the institution they both serve is not a recipe for genuine mutual regard. It is a recipe for exactly the kind of rivalry that has been quietly intensifying between them for years. What finally moved Anne from private concern to active intervention was not a single incident, but the cumulative weight of a pattern that she had been documenting with characteristic thoroughness for a considerable period of time. The specific activities of Camilla's grandson in royal adjacent spaces were, in Anne's assessment, the clearest and most actionable expression of that pattern. But they were actionable only because they sat within the context of a much larger and much longer history of observations that Anne had been assembling and that she had concluded, with the deliberateness that marks every significant decision she makes, could no longer simply be observed and recorded. They needed to be addressed. And the person best positioned to address them, given both his proximity to the specific spaces involved and his growing clarity of institutional purpose, was William. The decision to go to William rather than to Charles reflects, sources say, a judgment about the current and future architecture of power within the monarchy that Anne has been working through with characteristic unsentimental precision. Charles is the king. But Charles is also a man whose relationship with Camilla has defined the central chapter of his emotional life and whose capacity for clear-eyed institutional assessment of his wife's conduct is, in Anne's private view, significantly compromised by that history. Going to Charles with information about Camilla's family network would have required navigating a loyalty structure that Anne assessed as too complex and too emotionally freighted to produce the kind of direct and decisive response the situation required. Going to William did not carry that complication, and it carried instead the additional advantage of placing the information in the hands of the person who will ultimately be responsible for managing its consequences over the longest possible time horizon. Camilla's response and what it reveals. There is a version of Camilla Parker Bowles that the public has been carefully and consistently presented with over the past 2 decades. It is the version of a woman who has endured extraordinary public hostility with grace and resilience, who has earned her place within the royal family through patience and quiet determination, and who has emerged from one of the most sustained campaigns of public disapproval in modern British history, not merely intact, but genuinely beloved by a significant portion of the population that once regarded her with open contempt. It is a compelling story of personal redemption, and it is, in its broad outlines, a true one. But the woman who responded to the discovery that Princess Anne had been feeding detailed intelligence about her family's activities to Prince William is not the serene, warmly smiling figure of the public narrative. She is something considerably more complex. And the response she produced when the full picture of what Anne had done became clear to her revealed dimensions of her character that the carefully managed public version has never been designed to show. The moment at which Camilla became aware of the full extent of Anne's involvement is described by sources as a significant one. She had known relatively quickly that William's action against her grandson reflected a level of specific knowledge about his activities that could not have been assembled without inside assistance. The question of where that assistance had come from was one her circle had been working to answer from the moment the action's precision became apparent. When the answer pointed toward Anne, sources say Camilla's initial response was one of stillness. Not the stillness of someone absorbing a shock they had not anticipated, but the stillness of someone whose suspicions have just been confirmed, and who is taking a moment to fully absorb the implications of that confirmation before deciding how to respond. Those who know Camilla well describe her capacity for controlled emotional processing as one of her most formidable personal qualities. She does not, in moments of genuine crisis, allow her immediate emotional reaction to drive her behavior. She has learned, through decades of navigating some of the most hostile emotional terrain imaginable, to create a space between what she feels and what she does. That space is where her most consequential decisions are made. And the decision about how to respond to the revelation of Anne's involvement required her to inhabit that space for longer than most of the crises she had previously navigated, because the implications of what Anne had done were more structurally significant than anything Camilla's circle had previously been required to process. The personal dimension of Anne's betrayal, and sources are consistent in describing it in those terms within Camilla's household, was the layer that required the most careful emotional management. Camilla and Anne have never been close. Those who have observed their relationship over the years have always understood that the warmth projected in their public interactions was the product of professional discipline rather than genuine personal affinity. But there is a significant difference between the absence of warmth and the active decision to work against someone's interests by sharing sensitive information about their family with a third party. Camilla had always understood, at some level, that Anne's private assessment of her was not entirely sympathetic. What she had not anticipated, sources say, was that Anne's reservations ran deep enough and were substantiated by enough specific documented knowledge to produce the kind of detailed intelligence briefing that had given William the precision with which he had acted. The discovery that Anne had been actively accumulating information about her family's activities for a sustained period of time produced in Camilla, according to those close to her, a fundamental reassessment of the landscape of relationships within the royal family. She had operated, in her approach to Anne, with a set of assumptions about where the boundaries of their mutual restraint lay. Those assumptions had included a belief that whatever Anne's private reservations about her, the Princess Royal's own institutional discipline, and her long-established commitment to the performance of royal unity, would prevent her from taking active steps against Camilla's interests. The intelligence briefing to William had demolished those assumptions entirely. and the process of rebuilding her understanding of the relationship on more accurate foundations required a thoroughness of reassessment that Camilla is described by sources as undertaking with characteristic methodical attention. The practical response that emerged from that reassessment operated, as Camilla's responses invariably do, on multiple levels simultaneously. The public level remained unchanged. No acknowledgement of the situation was offered through official channels. No signal was sent through the carefully managed communications infrastructure of the Queen Consort's office that anything of significance had occurred. The performance of normalcy was maintained with a discipline that those who observed it from the inside found, given the circumstances, genuinely impressive. But beneath that surface performance, sources describe a period of intense private activity in which Camilla and her most trusted advisors undertook a systematic review of every significant relationship within the royal household through the lens of what Anne's actions had revealed. That review produced conclusions that insiders describe as both clarifying and sobering. It clarified, with uncomfortable precision, the degree to which Camilla had overestimated the security of certain relationships and underestimated the depth of reservations that existed in quarters she had previously assessed as broadly neutral. And it was sobering because the implications of those miscalculations extended well beyond the immediate dispute with William and Anne. They raised fundamental questions about the reliability of the information and the assessments on which Camilla had been basing her understanding of her own position within the institution. If Anne's true disposition had been so thoroughly misread for so long, the question of what else might have been similarly misread was one that could not be answered quickly or comfortably. What Camilla's response ultimately reveals is something important about the nature of power within the royal family and about the particular vulnerability of a position like hers. She came to the monarchy as an outsider who spent decades earning her way inside. That journey gave her resilience, tactical sophistication, and a hard-won understanding of how the institution works, but it also created blind spots. The energy she invested in securing her position and building her network was energy that could not simultaneously be invested in the kind of clear-eyed monitoring of the relationships around her that might have flagged Anne's activities earlier. She was watching the horizon, and the challenge came from inside the room. What this means for the war, inside the palace. There is a point in every prolonged conflict at which the accumulation of individual incidents stops being a series of separate events and becomes something else entirely. Something with its own momentum, its own internal logic, and its own capacity to produce consequences that none of the original parties fully anticipated when the first moves were made. The royal family has reached that point. The action William took against Camilla's grandson, the intelligence that Anne provided to make it possible, and the fallout that both have generated within the household are no longer simply the latest episodes in a running dispute between competing centers of power within the monarchy. They are the visible expression of a structural realignment that has been building for years and that has now reached a stage of development that makes a return to the previous equilibrium effectively impossible. The involvement of Princess Anne in the conflict is the detail that changes its nature most fundamentally. Anne is not a peripheral figure whose allegiances can be discounted or whose actions can be contained within a bilateral dispute. She is the king's only sister, one of the most respected and most senior figures within the institutional life of the monarchy, and a woman whose judgment carries a weight within the family that reflects decades of demonstrated commitment to the institution's integrity. Her decision to bring detailed intelligence about Camilla's family network to William was not a casual act. It was a considered institutional judgment about where the interests of the monarchy lay and who was best positioned to protect them. And that judgment, delivered by someone of Anne's standing, has shifted the balance of the conflict in ways that Camilla's considerable tactical sophistication will struggle to reverse. For William, the episode has produced a consolidation of his institutional position that goes beyond what the specific action against Camilla's grandson could have achieved on its own. The knowledge that Anne stands with him, not merely in the passive sense of wishing him well, but in the active sense of being prepared to share what she knows and to take deliberate steps in support of his institutional priorities, represents a significant strengthening of his position within the current reign. It signals to everyone watching the internal dynamics of the royal family that the alignment of senior figures around William's emerging authority is broader and deeper than Camilla's circle had previously assessed. The palace will continue to manage that strain through the tools it has always used: strategic silence, careful public positioning, the disciplined performance of unity in spaces where the cameras are rolling and the press is watching. But the distance between that performance and the private reality has rarely been greater. And the war inside the palace, whatever its ultimate resolution, is being watched by an institution that can ill afford the cost of losing. Did Princess Anne do the right thing by going to William, or did she cross a line that will permanently fracture the royal family? The palace is